You know the word ummah, U-double-M-A, or alif mim mim ta, is a very, very common word. It is used very commonly by Muslims. And it refers generally to the Muslim nation or the global community of Muslims. And then you'll have this word being used like Ummatul Islam, the Ummah of Islam, or the Ummah of Muhammad. And so, if you go to the Arab world, they'll call the Ummatay al-Islamiyya wal-Arabiyya, the Arabic nation and the Islamic nation. And so this is the way this word is used. But do you know that this word is not really used in that sense in the Holy Qur'an? In fact, in the Qur'an, the word ummah is a more generic term. It's a term that is not really value-laden, and often the word, which appears at numerous places in the Qur'an, will refer to good ummahs and bad ummahs that did well and ummahs that did poorly. And there's the oft-repeated verse, Tilka ummat qad khalat, those are the ummats that were of the past. And so to get an understanding of what this term really means, you need to really look at the occurrence in the Holy Qur'an. And then what comes forward, if you read the term in all its occurrences, is that an ummah appears to be a community of practice, a community that operated in tandem, that operated towards a particular goal. And that is really what comes out if you look at the usage of the word ummah in the Quran. So it's a dynamic community that in fact functioned as a whole and that worked towards a particular goal. Now that goal could be negative or positive. When we speak about the ummah in a positive sense, we mean it's that ummah that functions in a dynamic way towards a particular goal that is a noble and a lofty goal. Now, unfortunately, the term has been muddied or confused, and now the term ummah has taken on more or less the air or a sense of a nation. You know, and we know that nationalism is different from a community of practice, because nationalism, if the word ummah is to be used in a more or less synonymous way with the term nation, then what we get is a loyalty and a collaboration or a unification of people, not on a common goal, but rather on what they share to be common traits. And nations are defined by a common history, by common cultural practices, by common sort of aspirations and ideals, a common outlook. And so the idea of a nation, but then you do get an ethnicity also, which is akin to a nation, which could be a subset of a nation. So you could have a nation, and then within that nation, you could have a subgroup that has a different particular set of cultural practices, a different language, different outlook on life, different emphasis perhaps. And so we need to clearly understand what is an ummah and how does it relate to the idea of a nation or to an ethnicity. Are Muslims an ethnicity? Are Muslims a nation? And then there's another term also that we can throw into the mix, and that is the idea of a tribe. You see, and that's even more retrogressive, is to have affinity or allegiance to a tribe. Now, what is tribalism? Tribalism is again an affinity to sort of kinship, to also cultural practices, to common symbols, common heritage, common interest. And so that would be a tribe. I think mostly common interest would be very important in the concept of a tribe. And we know that Islam, the Islam of the 7th century, actually came to liberate humanity from that type of self-interested outlook on the world. In other words, from that tribalistic outlook on the world. And we wouldn't want to make the same mistake of resorting or going back to the cursed system that existed before Islam came, where people basically were at constant war because tribal interests dictated the state of war or peace between different peoples. And if we are being quite honest in our contemporary world, then the idea of nationalism is very similar to the idea of tribalism. And various nations of the world are also advancing their own interests instead of advancing the common well-being of mankind. And so let's then look at the idea of the Ummah within this context, within the context of tribes, nations, ethnicities, and so on. So Muslims often hold the belief that all non-Muslims are not part of the Ummah. They are unworthy, and in fact, Muslims commonly, even if they don't articulate it, we are being schooled at a very, very early age that these other people are somewhat lesser beings. The term non-Muslim is in fact not even a term. You know, there's no word non-Muslim in Arabic or in the Qur'an or anything. We don't regard people as non-Muslims, and using that term is completely senseless. You see, people are not non-Muslim. That's like saying people are non-white, or it's like saying people are non-South Africans. You know, it doesn't really make sense except in a very particular context. It's not a term that can be broadened beyond an immediate context. Right. And so what we rather prefer to do is that we have in Islam the idea of believers and rejectors. We have believers and we have rejectors. We have those who believe, who observe, who endorse truth and righteousness and justice and good, and you have those who are indifferent or reject it. And so that is a much better distinction. And so when we say that people are non-Muslim, it doesn't make sense. You need to say, are they averse to truth, or are they conducive or accommodating of truth? And so if people are averse to truth, then they are simply kafir. They are averse. The word kafir means being averse. So we have believers and we have kuffar. That's all. And I believe many Christians and many Jews are not in fact kuffar. They are not averse to truth. They could be, but you can only know that once you've offered them the truth. So that term non-Muslim doesn't really exist. We should avoid that term. It's not even in the hadith. The basis for this chosen nation myth, you know, when people desire or try to move towards chosenness, chosen status, they normally start off by regarding the rest as the other, as the non-X. You know, they are X and everyone else is non-X. So you'll find the Germans and the non-Germans. You'll find the Jews and the non-Jews, or the Gentiles, or the Goyim. And so Muslims have also now come up in a similar vein with the idea of non-Muslims. It is because we all aspire to raise our own status to that of the best, of some sort of chosenness. But that's a myth, and there's no basis for it. And the word Ummah of Islam, Ummah or Ummatul Mu'mineen, or Ummatul Arabiya, or these are terms that are completely alien to the Quran. In common usage, the word Ummah refers to Muslims as a global and sometimes a local community. So what we find is that I've heard people refer to the Ummah of North America, or the Ummah of the UK, or the Ummah of South Africa. And the word is also used in reference to other nations. So you would say, from the Hadith, people find that the Ummah of Musa, the Ummah of Isa, and that is what I've heard. The worst corruption of the word, actually, where the word has been misconstrued and misinterpreted, was actually, I can trace it back to the 19th century. In other words, in the 1800s, and especially the later 1800s, 1870, after 1848, after the revolutions in Europe, the 1848 revolutions in Europe, which started the European nationalist fervor, and it's nationalism is a creature, is a product of 19th century Europe. The idea of a country tribe, a tribe that is bound to a particular geographical area, is an ancient idea. That's tribalism, but it was updated after about 1848 to refer to the nation state. Right. So although you are very familiar now with the 200 nation members of the United Nations, it's a concept that is fairly recent. It's less than 200 years old, the concept of a nation state. So nationalism is a term that was born in Europe, and it started during the modernizing of Europe, especially in the 1800s. And nationalism sought to replace the broad affiliations that existed to religion, that existed prior to the French Revolution, because religion had a very strong influence on people. And it replaced those affiliations to cultural and religious ideals with affiliations to the state or to the nation. And it represents a widening of the concept of tribalism to include now the nation. The nation itself is held together by common heritage, a common language, common symbols, and as people would maybe understand, their common destiny to be. So out of the 19th century also grew the most infamous and barbaric version of nationalism. We know one of the ugly children or poisonous fruits of this era is in fact the Zionist movement, is the movement by secular or atheistic Jews to shape Judaism into a global nation, and in fact to assume that Judaism constitutes a global nation, and then to from that shape the idea of creating a land for the Jews in the diaspora, in the scattered or spread, the Jews that were spread throughout the globe. So what happens to people that exist, be across borders, but that share distinct symbols, a common history and a common cause? So Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, saw Zionism as the answer to the Jewish problem of a nation without a land in this era where everyone wanted to be a nation, so the era of nationalism. How did that affect Muslims? For Muslim activists, those that were seeking to respond intellectually to the powerful intellectual currents of the 19th century, the concept of the Ummah was then re-looked at and reinterpreted. And Muslim activists and scholars such as Jamaluddin Afghani, who was a Muslim revivalist of the 1800s, as well as in the 20th century, Ayatollah Khomeini, also a Muslim revivalist, used the term Ummah, or basically reinvented the term Ummah to now mean more than a nation of practice or a goal-directed community of practice, to connote a sort of a pan-Islamism. So the term Ummah was therefore tied to the global community of adherents to Islam. So we can see how the movements towards nationalism spurred on the idea of Zionism, and how the reaction to Zionism in the 1800s, a spin-off from that also is that Muslims also re-looked at the term Ummah to to tie some sort of label or identifying mechanism to the global community of adherents to Islam. But how useful is it to construct a genuine global community from something that is divided and fragmented, as we know the Muslims are? There are at least 2 or 3 major divisions in Islam, and they don't like each other. Let's be dead honest. The leadership within the 2 major divisions of Islam, the Shia and the Sunni, they frankly have no love for each other. If I say they have no love for each other, then I'm putting it very, very euphemistically, in fact. Furthermore, if the term Ummah should refer to an ideological community, then how can this be realized? How can we make this happen when Muslims are probably the least ideological people in the world today? We know that the Muslims are a people that are, in the main, a people of ritual and of custom. Muslims today, are people of symbol, tradition, and there's not a lot of thinking going on. They can be, and they can't be an ideological community, a community that is goal-directed. In the absence of a coherent way of thinking, of reasoning, and a global dialogue between Muslims. How do you form a goal-directed community when there is no ideological interaction or discourse? So the sad end result is that the term Ummah becomes watered down to connote a global community attached to common rituals, to common symbols, and to common traditions. The concept Ummah in popular usage therefore became very, very similar to the term nationalism as it is understood in the West. So it is not surprising then that many Muslim activists have taken to invoking, features that are outward, that are superficial of Islam, like the majority, the quick growth of Islam, some superficial features of Muslims, and driven that as a selling prospect or proposition for Muslims. And so instead of the ideas, instead of the ideological depth of Islam, we are selling now the superficial elements of Muslims and of Islam, as with other nations. And which is sad. The Ummah conceived of in the Qur'an is a very different Ummah. And I can give you a few quotes from the Qur'an. The way the word Ummah is used in the Qur'an is very, very different from the way Muslims think of it when we speak about the word Ummah. In the Qur'an, when it speaks about the best Ummah, it is an active community. It is a focused collectivist, or a focused collective that is focused on a goal. And let me give you a few examples. Quran 7 verse 181 says, "Of those we have created are an ummah who direct others with truth and dispense justice therewith." And Quran 3:110 states, "You are the best ummah evolved for mankind, enjoining what is right, forbidding what is wrong, and believing in Allah." And then Quran 2:143 also gives us more indications as to what this term ummah really means when it says, "Thus have we made you an ummah justly balanced, that you may be witnesses over the nations." So what we see from these verses is that the righteous ummah is a global community of activism, not ritual. It's a global community that transcends nation, tribe, and even other narrow religious affiliations. The global ummah conceived of in the Quran never ever gets described as the Ummah of Muhammad, or the Ummah of Muslims, or the Ummah of Islam, or the Ummah of the Arabs. These are all shallow and false attempts at imitating the destructive nationalism founded by modern Europe. The real Ummah, which the Holy Scripture refers to, is the community that are active in promoting truth, promoting justice, and in the acknowledgement of Allah as the supreme Lord and Master of all mankind. The bitter truth for us is to recognize that the term Righteous Ummah, which we have used to describe almost 2 billion Muslims globally, is far from it. The Righteous Ummah whom the Qur'an speaks of in praiseworthy terms is a united, activist global community focused on establishing truth and justice while acknowledging God or Allah or Jehovah as their supreme Lord. And whether they be Jewish, Christian, or any other denomination, that Righteous Ummah does not pride itself in numbers, but rather in the commitment, in the passion, and in the just cause of its members. Any conception of the term Ummah that relegates it to a community of ritual imitators results in Muslim nationalism. And that's just another form of chauvinism. And we need to be very honest. As Muslim nationalists, we are just another chauvinistic category of mankind, which is a trait we know of Shaitan. You know, Shaitan's primary crime is his chauvinism, is the fact that he told God, you created me of fire, and raising himself in status because of an artificial or a superficial attribute instead of a real quality. So when we become Muslim nationalists, we become Muslim Zionists, in fact, the Muslim Herrenvolk, the Muslim chosen people, a form of Islam where means override goals. Is it where we take our law, our Sharia, our fiqh and everything, and we make that which is a means, we make that the end in itself. And we judge not by the final goal or by the vision or the ideal that we share with others, but rather by our methodology and by our means by which we want to achieve those goals. So is it any wonder that we find so much similarity between the Salafist and the Zionist programs and strategies? If you look at them, they are two and opposites, mirror opposites, mirror images of itself. When the rest of humanity has been arbitrarily excluded from the so-called chosen nation or the Herrenvolk, then shedding their blood becomes so much easier without understanding the word Ummah. When we take Ummah to mean the chauvinistic, ethnocentric vision of ourselves as a superior people, shedding blood of the innocent becomes so much easier. And that is how shedding blood has been easy for the American patriot, for the Zionist, and for any other scoundrel in history that have used his own nation, his own ethnicity as the means by which he judges and distinguishes between other people. So here's a verse in the Qur'an that says, an interesting verse, chapter 10, verse 19, that says, mankind was but one ummah, but differed later. Had it not been for a word that went forth before from thy Lord, their differences would have been settled between them. So in general, we should regard ourselves as one ummah, the ummah of just, righteous people that are susceptible to the truth, versus that ummah which is averse and indifferent and in opposition to what is truth and righteous. And so we should constitute one ummah with all people who are righteous. Look at this verse also. This verse 2, chapter 2, verse 213 says, mankind was one ummah, and Allah sent messengers with glad tidings and warnings, and with them he sent the book in truth to judge between people in matters wherein they differed. The wrong understanding of the concept ummah threatens to divide mankind. The Quranic concept of ummah guides us towards establishing a global solidarity with all our sisters and brothers in humanity, interested in establishing a just world under the guidance of Allah Almighty, whether they call themselves Muslim, Christian, or by any other name. And our prayer should not be for us, for Allah to save the Muslims or to guide the Muslims, but to guide all those truth-loving people of the world, and so that we could become one ummah, a nation that chooses obedience to God, that chooses love of God, that chooses to oppose those who oppose God and His beautiful way that is in harmony with nature. And that really is the idea of ummah, a goal-directed community that shares the same goal, that do not always share the same methodologies and the same means, but that are moving towards the same objective. And that concept of ummah is the one that we need to rescue and move forward with. Alhamdulillah.